which is not happening right now. I will mute myself. So sorry. So guys, I'm on a call. Quiet. Okay. So they actually wanted to listen, so they're really into this Z versus L recession. We were talking about that at dinner last night, not the younger one, but the older one is wanting to hear what you have to say. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Tamara Ogle. I am a Purdue Extension Regional Community Development Educator, and I'm here with Dr. Larry DeBoer, a professor in the Department of Ag Econ. I guess I could have let you introduce yourself, but I didn't. And he's going to talk a little bit about the economic outlook and how that affects state and local government in Indiana. And I'll go ahead. I know he'll give this precursor, but I'll give this as well, or caveat. We just don't know yet. So these are all somewhat educated guesses without the data. And so we have started having conversations about this on March 13th as we drove to our very last in-person program for an extended period of time of how this would affect our local governments and in what ways immediately, but also longer term. And so that's what we're going to discuss today. We do have about 100 people on. Feel free to use the chat box for questions, or if you have some answers that we don't have, feel free to share in there. I will kind of watch the chat box, Larry, so you don't have to be doing that too. And when we get to that point, just let me know, and I can share with you what's in there. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. The way I heard your introduction is we don't know anything, but we're going to talk for an hour anyway. You're looking at the title there, the Economic Outlook and State and Local Government in Indiana, and I gave it a broad title so that I could include anything I could think of, anything I've learned, some speculations, anything that I think might be useful. And so that's what this is an attempt to apply some logic, look at what data is out there, and boy, there's not much yet, and try to at least speculate on where we're going and what the impacts might be. Let's see, let me get up there. There we go. There it goes. Here's something that's useless. This was my last Outlook forecast. It was done on February 11th, 2020. And it was for a presentation actually in the first week of March. The people who sponsored this particular talk needed the materials in advance. And by the time I was actually presenting this forecast, we already knew that something was going on, that this forecast was in fact obsolete. And so I had to tell the folks there, you know, you make a forecast and 2.5 weeks later you figure, it's still got to be good. What could happen in 2.5 weeks? Well, what could happen is pretty significant. What I was forecasting was what everybody else was forecasting, which was basically more of the same. We had a 10.5-year expansion, longest expansion in American history. It was a slow expansion, but it was the steadiest expansion in American history. Growth rates in the low 2s for almost 10 years, an unemployment rate at a 50-year low at 3.5%, inflation running near 2%, like it has more or less since the mid-1990s, and very low interest rates on both the short-term and long-term treasuries. And you can see down there, recession question mark, and my answer was no. I don't think we were heading for a recession until. To my credit, and this is the only credit I could take, the last slide that I showed for this forecast had a list of reasons why the forecast would be wrong. And yes, one of the reasons was pandemic. And but boy, I can't claim to have had any inkling of just how big the impact is and will be. So let's talk about that. So what is happening here? And you know, so the little logo I put up there is the flatten the curve logo that we've all become familiar with. What is happening? Well, there's this virus, coronavirus, COVID-19. And to stop the spread of the virus, we have to isolate ourselves from one another. There's no vaccine, there's no pharmaceutical solution to this thing. And so we have to isolate ourselves from one another to let the virus essentially die out. But most economic activity takes place in groups. We shop in groups, we consume entertainment in groups, we work in groups. And we can't be in groups, and that means we have to shut down a large part of the economy. So just kind of a brief application of a 5-minute model, call it that, of the Corona recession. Another name we've heard out there. Supply is decreasing. Right? Supply chains were interrupted. That's the first thing we noticed when the virus hit China, and we noticed that an awful lot of the world's supply chains ran through China. Supply chain meaning the raw materials turned into parts, turned into assembly. We're assembling the parts, then shipped to customers. It's the path from of production, the path of production from the origins of a product to its delivery to the consumer. The supply chains ran through China. Those were interrupted. Right? Transportation was suspended. Factories were closed, and supply chains were interrupted. And we said, okay, that's an impact that we're going to have in our economy. Supply will be reduced. That turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg, the canary in the coal mine, if you will. What else is happening? Well, employees afraid to come to work. What do you want to do? Go into a group of people, some of whom may be infected, and we've certainly heard the bad stories of people in groups. Mardi Gras, for example, at the end of February, before everybody knew what the problem was and how that spreads the disease. So people afraid to go to work, people getting sick, so you can't employ folks. Somebody gets sick in the factory and you have to shut down the whole thing to disinfect it. People being quarantined, and then, of course, the mandated closures of so many businesses. So that reduces supply. But demand is decreasing too. If people fear to associate in groups, then they're not going to shop. They're not going to travel. They're not going to go to their usual entertainment venues. Not going to go to the movies and to concerts. And then mandated social isolation reduces shopping even more. And notice that this decline in demand is then going to affect the amount of goods supplied, even if your business is operating, even if your employees are at work, even if your supply chain is not interrupted, demand is down, nobody's coming to buy, your sales are down, and you may end up closing your business for that reason. So the supply and the demand interacting to depress the economy, or at the very least, severely recess the economy. And then there's financial markets, and that is as dangerous a thing as anything we're talking about here. And there's lots of different ways financial markets could be affected. But let's consider this. Businesses don't have sales, so they're not pulling in their usual revenue. Households don't have income, so they're not pulling in their usual income. Sales and incomes fall, and so what do? You have to withdraw funds from banks. You have to take out loans from lenders. You have to draw on credit lines, and lenders have to meet this demand for cash. But you know, the money's not in the vault. Just listen to Jimmy Stewart during It's a Wonderful Life. He'll tell you, the money's not in the vault. It's out there in assets, in long-term loans. And so in order to meet the demands for cash, lenders have to sell those assets. Well, if all the lenders try to sell their assets all at once, the value of those assets are going to be depressed, and boy, we've seen some of that. It could be that they don't recoup enough off those assets at those fire sale prices to actually meet the demands from cash from their depositors and from their creditors and from their borrowers. And you know, at worst, that could drive financial institutions into insolvency. And so lenders, in response to that, will increase their reserves, which means they don't make loans. And if lenders are pessimistic, keeping higher reserves out of the deposits and the loans that they themselves get, and not lending money, well, the financial markets could shut down, as they did during the Great Recession for a while. And that's another danger that we have to worry about. So supply, demand, financial markets, all of these things now in recession mode. And then the question is, just how severe is the recession likely to be, and how long will it last? So what do Now, we will get a first quarter. That is, the first quarter just ended yesterday. Right? So, data is not available instantly on these things. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, U.S. Department of Commerce, has to spend almost a month tabulating the data for just the preliminary report. So, first quarter 2020 GDP growth will be released on April 29th. But let's face it, that will be about 11 weeks of normal activity and 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks of March, of recession. And so it won't at all reflect the full impact of what's going on right now. It'll probably be negative. That is, we'll probably see a decline in gross domestic product, but it won't be nearly as negative as to what we're experiencing right now. To get that read, to figure out what's really happening, we'll have to wait for the second quarter GDP growth rate, and that's April, May, and June. That's starting today, and those numbers won't be released, the preliminary numbers won't be released until July 30th. That's a long time from now. That's months and months and months from now before we get a read on GDP growth, right? 4 months from today. What about the unemployment rate? Well, as it happens, we will get the report on March unemployment this Friday, day after tomorrow. It's usually the first Friday of the month, unless the first Friday of the month is the first day of the month, in which case it's the second Friday of the month. The unemployment rate in February was 3.5%, a 50-year low. So we were doing just fine. The economy was just fine. Obviously, it's got problems, but as by these measures, the economy doing just fine. The March unemployment rate, well, you think, okay, here we're going to get a read day after tomorrow on what's going on, except we won't, because the unemployment survey week is always the week that includes the 12th of the month. That's the Bureau of Labor Statistics rule of thumb as to when they take the survey. So the week that includes the 12th is the week that the unemployment rate is measured. Well, that was the second week of March, and that's before most of what has happened took place. And so it's quite possible that the unemployment rate we'll see the day after tomorrow will still be quite low. I've done some back of the envelope stuff on this, and heck, it could still be 4, which is terrific. And so we're not going to see the full impact on the labor force until the April unemployment rate, and that's not released until May 8th. So 5 more weeks before we get a full read on what is the impact on the labor market. But what do we have to do? What do we have to resort to? We have to resort to the data out there that is daily or weekly. And the daily data is almost entirely financial markets data. So let's take a look at least as to what's happening in financial markets. As I said, that's one of the important impacts of this thing. Well, here's the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a price index of the values of stocks of 30 major industrial, not just industrial now, but 30 big important companies. The Microsofts and Disneys are in there as well. And as you can see, great big drop. We now classify this as a bear market, ending the 10-year bull market that we've experienced. Most of the gains for the last 3 years have dropped off. If you take a look at the last year, and here's the last year from March of 2019 to March 2020, and these data go up through March 30th. February 12th was the peak of this bull market. It went down 37% from February 12th to March 23rd. It went down, as you can see, in fits and starts. Big decline, big decline, big increase, big decline, big decline, big decline, big increase. And that's usually what happens when the stock market is crashing, you will have alternate days of big drops and then big increases, but more drops than increases. That's what happened in 1929. In October, November of 1929, the stock market went down, in fact, in the 30% range, like we've experienced here. It kept going down, of course, for another 3 years. But we've got now something of a recovery. And is that the bottom? I have no clue. One suspects maybe not, but at any rate, we're down 24% as of March 30th from February 12th. Let me take a look at my Wall Street Journal indicators there. If you go to the Wall Street Journal, they will get you. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is down 3% today. So we're falling. That's a pretty good drop, but not as big as some of the earlier drops that we've seen. So stock market is down. What does that mean? That means that investors are anticipating that profits of corporations and businesses are going to be down significantly over the next few months. Here are the corporate bond interest rates. So we've got two interest rates up here. Average interest rates on corporate bonds. And corporate bonds, those are the bonds that corporations issue in order to borrow money from investors in the bond market. We've got two interest rates here. One that Moody's, for corporations that Moody's rates as BAA, and one for AAA. Now the BAA corporations are those corporations that will almost certainly pay you back unless they don't. These are riskier corporations. So lending to these corporations, you put your money at greater risk. And that means that fewer people want to lend to these corporations, which means they have to pay higher interest rates in order to borrow. You also see the AAA corporations there, and those are the folks who are absolutely going to pay you back, no question whatsoever, no matter what economic conditions are, probably because they've got enough money in the bank already to pay you back, and those are the Microsofts of the world, AAA corporations. And you can see what happened here in March. Both sets of interest rates went up, and that's exactly what you'd expect from financial markets under stress. When lots of people are trying to borrow, when lots of people are removing deposits from lenders, one would expect that corporations trying to borrow from financial institutions that are restricting their lending, that interest rates for everybody would go up, and certainly that's what happened. Now you'll notice the AAA corporation rate came down again, down to 3%, whereas the BAA, the more risky corporations, are still elevated. And the difference between these two, the spread between the BAA and the AAA corporation interest rate, is a pretty good indicator of what's going on in financial markets, how confident they are, how pessimistic they are. And you can see on the screen, I hope, the period of the Great Recession. That's the gray bar from 2007 to 2009. And that wasn't just pessimism, that was panic right there. The percent difference between the two, BAA and AAA, got up to 3.5%. So what happens there is that lenders say, hey, in this environment, in this terrible economic environment, you do not want to lend to more risky corporations. Let's put all our money in the AAA corporations because we know they will pay us back. And so the difference between the interest rates that the more risky and less risky corporations have to pay gets much wider. And that 3.5% distance between the two, that 3.5% spread at the peak, or at the trough, I should say, of the Great Recession, was the highest spread since 1938. And so to say that this was that was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, well, here's evidence of it. We haven't seen that kind of spread yet. Spread right now is about 1.7, 1.8 between the two. And so that indicates certainly pessimism, but maybe not panic just yet. Well, here's another kind of interest rate. This is the interest rate for lending to the federal government for 10 years, the 10-year Treasury bond. So the federal government goes out and borrows money. Boy, they're going to be borrowing a lot of money, borrowing money in order to finance the difference between what they spend and what they take in taxes. And that interest rate, as you see, is down. Again, we'll look at the Wall Street Journal, see where we are. It is down at 0.6% today. And that is the lowest 10-year Treasury bond interest rate ever, which is quite the thing to say, because you know our Treasury has been issuing bonds for a very, very long time. Think about what that means, though. That's an indication of pessimism as well. Now, you know, the reason you want to lend to the Treasury is that you're absolutely certain that you're going to be paid back, right? Treasury, United States government hasn't missed an interest payment in 240 whatever years, and so it's the most secure asset in the world. And so when people get worried about lending in the private sector or lending anywhere else, they park their money in Treasury bonds. They're parking so much money in Treasury bonds that the interest rate has now been pushed down to 0.6%. But think about what that means. People are now willing to tie their money up for 10 years. Of course, it's a secondary market, you can't sell it, but essentially tying their money up for 10 years at 0.6%. Now, we know the inflation rate is going to be about 2, which means they're lending at less than the inflation rate, which means 10 years from now, the money they get paid back will be valued less than the money that they lent. And yet, this is what investors are willing to do. What must that mean? It must mean that they expect short-term interest rates to be even lower than that, and that they expect it to be lower for the next decade. There's no reason to take your money out of a 10-year bond and invest short-term because you think the short-term rates are going to be low. Wow, is all you can say there. That is quite a statement of pessimism on the part of investors. Could depress interest rate returns for a long time to come, that the Fed in particular will be depressing short-term interest rates throughout most of the decade of the 2020s. So that's what that says. And here's another spread. This is the spread between the AAA corporate bond interest rate and the 10-year Treasury rate. So one of the things that investors do is move money from more risky to less risky corporations. But another thing they do is to move money out of private lending altogether and into the Treasury to keep their money safe. And you can see that the spread went up for at least one day higher than it was during the Great Recession. Now, it's come down. It's about 2.3 now, so it's sort of in the middle of that range that you see right there. So 2.3, but 2.3, again, is higher than at any time since the Great Recession. So I would say, again, financial markets, pessimistic, definitely pessimistic, perhaps not panicky yet, but we've got these indications, the daily indications that we get, that certainly all is far from right in the financial world. What about exchange rates? You know, one of the things that happens is all over the world, people say, where can we keep our money safe? Where can we park our money so that we at least get our money back so that whoever we're lending to doesn't default? And the answer all over the world is U.S. Treasury bonds. But if you're going to invest in U.S. Treasury bonds, lend money to the U.S. Treasury, you got to have dollars. And if you need dollars, you've got to exchange your own currencies for dollars, and that drives up the demand for the dollar, and that drives up the value of the dollar. And here I've got the Canadian dollar exchange rate. Usually you see euros or yen or yuan, but let's pick Canada because, well, we like Canada usually, and Canada is one of our major trading partners, of course. In fact, our economies are pretty well integrated together, and they're at the same level of development as we are. And so what you see there is kind of a pure exchange rate response, not due to differences in our economies. And so it shows you an increase. So the value of the dollar in Canadian was $1.33 Canadian to $1 US at the beginning of March, got up to $1.45 Canadian to $1 US, and is now at about $1.41 Canadian. What does that mean? It means our exports are more expensive. Our exports to Canada are more expensive. Our imports from Canada are less expensive to the extent that we're exporting anything these days. And of course, we won't get a read on what exports are for quite some time. But to the extent that we're exporting anything, our exports are more expensive. And that might discourage our exports. So that can be a problem as well for the economy. Well, that's financial markets. What about the real economy? And when economists say the real economy, we mean not money, we mean production, consumption, employment. And indicators about that are quite scarce. But I'm sure you saw the one good indicator that we get every week, which is initial claims for unemployment insurance. And what this is people losing their jobs, laid off, fired, whatever it is, eligible for unemployment insurance, and showing up at the unemployment insurance office or applying online and saying, hey, I'm without a job, but I'm eligible for unemployment benefits. I put in a claim. I make a claim, a new claim. So initial claims are the people who are newly unemployed making claims for unemployment insurance. And state offices, local offices all over the country report these numbers, and they are tabulated, and we get initial claims for unemployment insurance. We get it every week. We get it on Thursday mornings for what happened the week before. Well, this is the data going back to 1967 all the way to 2019 through December of 2019, and I'll show you why I wanted to show it this way here in a minute. You can see the worst it's been, the recession of 1981-82, 1 week there were almost 700,000 new applications for unemployment insurance. During the Great Recession, the number got up to about 670,000, and these were the biggest numbers on record. Ready? Here's what happened last Thursday. 3.3 million applications. Remember, the previous record had been just short of 700,000, 3.3 million. That little bump that you see off to the left in the gray shaded area during the Great Recession, that was the, yes, there it is. That's the big 670,000 number. And from now on forever, it's going to look like a little bump in the road. Every previous economic downturn is now going to look minuscule compared to what happened on Thursday, 3.3 million. Well, tomorrow it's Thursday. We're going to get another report, aren't we, about what has happened. And what's going to happen? Well, you know, I suppose it could snap back to where it had been before. Well, no, I don't really suppose it could. It won't. For one thing, that 3.3 million was an understatement, as we know, an understatement of what must have happened, of the total number of people who became unemployed because they overwhelmed the unemployment application system. Right? The websites froze, the phone lines were tied up, and so on. So certainly, at the very least, hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of people who wanted to apply for unemployment insurance last week couldn't do it, or the week before couldn't do it, and then did it in this most recent week. And that what we got is reported tomorrow. So I kind of expect another day in the millions tomorrow, but we'll see. Right? So this is the weekly information, one of the few weekly indicators we get for what is happening in the real economy, what is happening to employment. So I thought, well, can we use this data? I mean, it's a data about unemployed people. Can we use this data to guess at what the unemployment rate would be? And so here what I've done is to plot the two, the initial claims for unemployment, which is in black, the black line there. And then the red line is the level of unemployment, the total number of people unemployed. And as you can see, they move up and down together. This is not perfectly aligned, but they move up and down together. And the scale for the initial claims is on the left, and the scale for the unemployment level is on the right. But they are correlated. And they are particularly correlated when unemployment is rising, because you can figure that when unemployment is rising, everybody who is unemployed this week will still be unemployed next week. So the number of unemployed people accumulates week after week, and so would end up equaling or being close to equal to the total monthly number. And here's a scatter diagram about that. Oh, you know, it had to do with scatter diagram. This is the period of time, April 2006 to March 2009, so about 3 years worth of data. And I put the points there, and on the horizontal axis, you see the initial claims. So that's the sum of the weekly numbers. And on the vertical axis, you see the number of unemployed people in total. And there's an equation. And it's a really good fit, right? There's a really tight relationship. The R squared there of 0.98 means that the dots are really close to the line. So this is the last time that unemployment ran up. April 2006 was the low point of claims, initial claims in the AAA expansion, and March 2009 was the high point, the most initial claims in the Great Recession. So we put those things together and we come up with a relationship between initial claims and the number of unemployed. And then we extrapolate. And here's the extrapolation. Now those dots that I just gave you are now in that little corner on the lower left. And the dotted lines are the extrapolation of that line out to what we can expect from what we saw with initial claims on Thursday. If the initial claims from Thursday are simply added to the previous number of unemployed, the unemployment rate, the equation says the unemployment rate is 12%. If what happened last Thursday goes on for an entire month, the unemployment comes out at 39%. Now, let's face it, this is an extrapolation way beyond our experience, right? And out of sample extrapolations like that, out of experience extrapolations are very, very iffy. So what can we say about this? Here's a couple of things I could say. We are about to see the biggest, in April, the biggest 1 month jump in the unemployment rate ever by far. The previous biggest jump was 1.3 points back in the early 50s, and we're gonna blow away that record. How big is it going to go? Well, you know, how much of the economy have we shut down? And I'll come up with a number on that here in a little bit. We've shut down quite a bit of the economy. The 12.1 probably understates it, but that's definitely the lower bound. 39%, how high is 39%? Well, what was the highest unemployment rate during the Great Depression of the 1930s? It was in 1932, and it was 22.9. 39% would be historically large, and it could happen. I'm not going to, tell you that that's what it's going to be, because this is way outside our experience. But I suspect we're going to see, we'll definitely see double digits in April, and we could rival the Great Depression. Here's another measure that I discovered, and lots of people are scrambling to try to find some weekly data about what's happening to real activity, that is, to employment and production and consumption. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has come up with an index that they call the Weekly Economic Index, and it's scaled to GDP. So you see through 2015, 16, 17, 18, you see growth rates in the neighborhood of 2%, and that's what was happening with GDP. And so they take 7 daily or weekly indicators that are out there. And these are mostly from private sector sources, private associations and so forth, that poll their members and just to figure out what's going on week to week. So retail sales, initial claims are in there, weekly staffing index, daily survey of consumers, raw steel production, electric utility output, U.S. fuel sales. These are all numbers that you can get from private source, mostly private sources, but come out weekly, and they put those together in an index, and the weekly guess at what's happening through March 21st said GDP is down 4.5%, and that's through March 21st, and that was only the beginning of the decline that we've seen. Minus 4.5% would be a bigger decline than what we saw in any year during the Great Recession, and rivals what happened during the Great Recession. So we're at least in a recession as deep as what we experienced back in 2007, 8, and 9. I don't think there's any doubt about that. All right, we need a number. In order to go forward here, we need a number. How much out there is shut down? And I'm going to try to make a guess about that, and let's emphasize guess. But at least let me show you how I came up with this guess. One of the things I did was try to figure out what is actually being shut down out there, and you can read the list of what's essential and what's non-essential, and you can see what your own experience is. But I also took a look at the Indiana Economic Digest. I really recommend that, by the way, as a nice compilation of economic news. And here are some of the headlines that I found, right? What do we see? Auto manufacturing shutdown takes toll on Northwest Indiana steel industry. U.S. Steel and ArcelorMittal taking blast furnaces offline because of the auto plant shutdown. So, the auto plant, well, here you go, right? Nobody's buying cars. Cars are piling up on the lot. Manufacturers of automobiles shut down their plants, both because nobody's buying and because of they don't want people associating with one another. Auto plants shut down, we don't need as much steel. Steel plants shut down. The whole thing rolls through the economy. We've got U.S. Steel idling their Gary Works blast furnace, but also slashing capital spending. That is, construction and equipment purchases not going to take place now. So that will close down more industries, even those that are not officially shut down through government order, going to shut down because nobody's buying the stuff. Amazon workers at Jeffersonville facility fear exposure advised. Now, Amazon, one guesses, is working flat out. They've been actually hiring, but somebody at the warehouse there in Jeffersonville tested positive and they had to shut it down and disinfect, and then left it shut down. Two biggest hotels in Indianapolis suspend operations. Well, we know what's happening to hotels and entertainment and travel. Coronavirus leaves local hotels mostly vacant. We've no money for payroll, no money for anything. And you know, what's happening to businesses out there, especially medium-sized and small businesses, you know, they survive on their sales, and their sales have disappeared. Southern Indiana Casino in Rising Sun lays off 407 workers. Casinos shut down. Talk about groups of people for entertainment. You don't want to be in a casino. Now, of course, some businesses expand. Businesses involved in medical production expand. Coronavirus creates boom at Washington Business, providing personal protective equipment for its medical customers. Jasper's Kimball Electronics hiring to meet medical demand. GM recalls 1,000 workers to build ventilators at the Kokomo plant. That was certainly in the news. So some businesses are expanding, but many, many more, as we know, are closing down. So here's what I did. You can get the data for the Indiana economy from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and this is the data on income. So what we want to do is figure out how much income is not being earned. So I took the most recent data, the most recent annual data for the Indiana economy, which is from 2018, but that's okay because we just want to get a sense as to what percentage is being shut down. And so here's what I said. What's shut down? I thought at first construction, but then I had to deliver some groceries. My wife and I did to my mom, who's locked down in a retirement community. And as we were driving, we noticed that some construction sites are shut down, but others appear to be working. So let's say about half of construction shut down. Durable goods manufacturing, including autos, are shut down. Non-durable goods manufacturing, except for food, beverage, and fuel refineries, shut down. Retail trade, except groceries, pharmacies, and gas stations, and maybe hardware stores and supply stores, shut down. Air and ground passenger transportation shut down. Real estate, I don't think anybody's showing houses. That's shut down. Arts, entertainment, recreation, shut down. Accommodation and food services, of course, are shut down. And many other services as well shut down. What is not shut down? Well, agriculture, of course, mining and utilities. I don't think, no, utilities certainly not, but I don't think the mines are shut down. It's a relatively small share of the economy for the state as a whole. But I tried to look, and I think they're still operating. Food and beverage manufacturing, we've got to process food. Refineries, wholesale trade, I think I'm thinking about the warehouses and that sort of thing. I think they're still going. Retail and groceries, pharmacies, hardware supply, motor fuel gas stations are working. Rail, water, truck transportation, and warehousing still going. So passenger transportation shut down, but transportation of goods seems to be going. Finance, insurance, rental, leasing, professional management, education services, these are the telecommuters. They can keep on working. And so I think they're going on. Of course, healthcare and social assistance working, and then some. And then federal, state, and local government, for the most part, I believe, are out there working. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So if you take those assumptions and you say, all right, let's eliminate those things that are shut down and not eliminate those things that aren't, what is our economy, what does our income in Indiana look like? Here's the pie chart. All right, so this is income by source in Indiana 2018 by percentages, and I've got it lined up, green continuing, light green mostly continuing, and gray mostly shut down. And so what do we see? Well, one thing to remember is that 28% of income is not generated by current business. And we've got dividends, interest, and rent up there. Now, what's going to happen to that income? That's hard to say. Dividends with a lag, I suspect. Well, no, corporation profits will be down, and so dividends will be down, but maybe not right away. Interest, well, if you've made a loan, that interest is still owed. There might be defaults, so maybe interest is down, but not right away. Rent, some landlords are forgiving rent. Some people are not going to be able to pay the rent, but the rent is still owed. So let's keep that slice in the pie. Let's say that continues. Net transfer payments, well, that's government, and that slice is going to get bigger, right? $1,200 coming to each of us, unless your income is too high, 11%. So that's going to keep continuing as well. So that slice, that 28% right there, probably pretty safe. Healthcare at 9%, safe. State and local government, safe at 7%. I got wholesale, I got federal government, I got agriculture. So that's a little less than half the total continuing without much impact. Mostly continuing, well, what do we see there? We see transportation. Well, transportation mostly continuing because most transportation is transportation of goods, but the passenger transportation shut down. Professional services, real estate shut down, but I've got everything else going because those are the telecommuters. Those are the folks who can work at home online. And now here's the rest of it, right? Other, just sort of miscellaneous services out there. Construction, half and half. Retail, mostly shut down. Manufacturing, mostly shut down. Accommodation and entertainment, almost entirely shut down. When you take the stuff that's continuing and the stuff that's shut down, I come up with a 26% income loss and a 36% employment income loss. That is 36%, or I should say the 26%, that is that gray portion right there, out of the 72% that is not dividends, interest, rent, and net transfer payments. You come up with 36%. So 26 and 36%. That 36% number looks familiar because if you add that 36%, say that's the employment loss as well as the income loss from employment, 36% plus the February unemployment rate is 39.5, and that's what we come up with when we extrapolated from the initial claims. So two different methods coming up with the same number always increases your confidence a little bit. Now, I'm still not going to say, hey, that's what we're going to see in April, but no, it could be. It definitely could be. Let's take that 26% number there and go to the state. All right, state revenue loss. What are we looking at? Well, here, by the way, the budget 2019 should actually say actual 2019, but here's 4 years worth of general fund revenues from the state. And so 2020, the fiscal year we're in right now, $17 billion and change. What happens if we subtract 26% of that for 1 month? That's $370 million. If we subtract 26% for 1 quarter, say April, May, June, we're shut down in April, May, June, that'd be $1.1 billion. 26% for half a year, we're shut down from April, May, June, July, August, September, that's $2.2 billion. Can we handle that? Well, here's the balances. Right? Balances at the end of fiscal year 2020 expected to be $2.4 billion. 370 million if it only lasted a month, and that's not going to be true, but if it did, we'd sail through that no problem. 1.1 billion if it lasts 3 months. Okay, we've got enough to handle that. 2.2 billion if it lasts 6 months. Well, no, in fact, we don't have enough to handle that because you'll notice the rule of thumb minimum. We got to keep enough money on hand to handle cash flow. And we've never really pushed balances down below 5% of the budget. So if that's the minimum, that 5%, about $850 million. So we've essentially got 1.6 billion to play with as far as filling in a revenue gap. And at the number, there is, at that number, 370 million at 1.6 billion, that's 4 or 5 months. So we can cover a revenue loss on the 26% range for 4 or 5 months. After that, something's got to give. One of the things that might happen, though, is federal aid. Now, the federal aid package, the CARES Act that was just passed, the $2 trillion, does include money for state and local governments. But it looks to me, anyway, like most of that is aid for coronavirus expenses. How much of that could be used to fill in a revenue loss? I'm just not sure, actually. Money is fungible. Perhaps much of it could be used for that purpose, but maybe not. And that tells me that we're going to have a round 4 on federal aid if this thing lasts anything more than 3 months. An awful lot of states are going to run out of balances and going to have to start cutting spending, and that would, of course, make the recession worse. Last Thursday, press conference, the governor and budget director Chris Johnston, OMB director, I should say, Chris Johnston, actually addressed the issue. And so what was said, Governor Holcomb anticipates using up to $1 billion from the $2.4 billion budget reserve to carry Indiana through the current budget year. Well, current budget year, that's the next 3 months, 26% decline, that's $1 billion. So maybe they're using the same numbers we are, but that looks familiar. Here's what Chris Johnson said. We plan to continue the existing appropriations and funding for schools as was adopted in the budget through the rest of this biennium. Well, sure, we plan to, but that sentence cries out for a but, and then it came in the next sentence. But this will be influenced by the availability of future revenues, uncertain economic conditions, and the flexibility afforded in the recently adopted federal assistance legislation. Basically, if we go on like this for 4 or 5 months, then we're going to have to start looking at our appropriations. And you do remember last time, the schools in particular, and the universities as well, saw their spending cut below appropriations in order to save money. The state certainly doesn't intend to do that, hopes not to have to do that. If the federal money is flexible enough to fill in the gaps, might not have to do that, but it will be on the table if this thing goes on long enough. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What about local government? Well, headlines about local government, and you folks in local government will know better than I do what's going on, but here's some headlines I found about local government. Indiana schools have closed, of course, have closed, but are still operating. The teachers are still working, and given at least the abilities of people to do e-learning, the learning is still going on now. I can tell you, I had an email from a student, because we're doing this at the university as well. I had an email from a student saying, rural broadband, haven't got it, no such thing, where she lived, and was wondering, should I come back to campus in order to use Purdue's online facilities, to use Purdue's broadband, essentially risk her health to get her college education, and we don't want that. The university found a way to do it, but boy, the facilities are quite limited, and rural broadband a problem right now for e-education, K through 12 and university. Cancels boys basketball tournament, of course. Meals provided to the public in Connersville by city and local businesses and churches, supplementing what's offered by schools. You know, this is the really, one of the really difficult parts of this is, sure, e-learning can take place online, but we depend on our schools for an awful lot of social services as well, and we have to scramble to find ways to get that done. First responders increase protective measures to combat spread of coronavirus. First responders working as hard as ever, of course. Delaware County court system down to the bare minimum, so courts not operating on full schedules. Indigo, mass transit, buses cut schedule, eliminate fares due to the coronavirus. And then property tax delays bring uncertainty to local governments. Well, how about that? Let's think about local government revenues for a minute. Okay, levies are fixed. All right, the levy was set at the beginning of the budget year, and that's what we expect to collect. And ultimately, probably most of that money gets collected. Question is when, right? Governor has said, hey, we're going to waive the penalties for late payment, the delinquency penalties, for 60 days. Well, that sends us out from May 10th to June to July 10th. What does that mean? What if people take advantage of this, and what if the payments in May are down, and that means the distributions in June would be lower than expected from the levy? If that happens, then revenues will be down now, right? Revenues from the June distribution would be down. And so we could, even though the property tax is generally very stable in recessions, we may see impacts real quick. And then just regular old tax delinquency as well. People may owe their taxes, but if they're not working and not earning income, they may end up being delinquent. So DLGF put out a memo just a couple of days ago about what to do if you don't receive if you don't receive a large fraction of your levy, what sorts of fund transfers can be done, what sorts of borrowing can be done to tide you over until that money does arrive. So there might be some short-term impacts on the property tax. What about longer-term impacts? Well, the sort of intermediate run, and we learned this from the last recession, If this thing lasts long enough now to reduce property values, now property values did decline in the Great Recession, but that went on for 18 months. If this thing lasts long enough to depress property values, then that will affect tax bills in 2022. And of course, the reason for that is that property values now work their way into assessments in 2021, which are the basis for tax payments in 2022. So if assessed values go down for the tax bills in 2022, then to raise your maximum levy, your tax rates must go up. And if that pushes some of your taxpayers further above the tax caps, then you don't collect as much of your property tax. Trending plus the tax caps have made the property tax more vulnerable to recessions, but with a 2-year lag. So that's a second consideration. But then there's an even longer run impact. And consider this. I didn't think of this until yesterday afternoon, and I was like, oh my gosh. Think about this. 26% decline in income. If that lasts long enough, we'll get a negative number for Indiana income change here in 2020. That will enter the maximum levy growth quotient calculation in 2022. Remember, maximum levy growth quotient depends on 6-year average of statewide non-farm income growth. So if we have a negative number here in 2020, we'll know that negative number by the middle of 2021, and that will be incorporated into the maximum levy growth quotient starting in 2022, and it will remain in the quotient until 2027. And you may remember that the 2009 number, that negative number, remained in the quotient, I think it was until 2017. So, you know, this could have a very long run impact on property taxes. If we have a significant negative number here this year, it's likely to depress growth in the maximum levy for most of the 2020s, or at least out till 2027. And then, of course, we have another, I mean, if this thing really lasts a long time, we could have a depressed number in 2021 as well, but, you know, bite my tongue on that. What about local income taxes? Well, one might think that if income is down, local income tax collections will be down, and they will, but the distributions were set last July. And my understanding is, and I had this confirmed by somebody I trust who knows, the state can't short local governments without legislation. That is, there are rules in the Indiana Code about what must be distributed. And the way the distribution of local income taxes works is the distribution for 2021 will be set based on the collections through the middle of 2020. Now remember, 2020 income tax payments are based on income earned in 2019. So we wouldn't necessarily see an impact in 2021. We would expect to see an impact in 2022 because if income earned in 2020 is down, that means collections in 2021 or payments in 2021 would be down. And that would mean distributions in 2022 would be down. However, the state has delayed the payment deadline for income taxes until July 15th, just like the IRS did for the federal payment, and that's after the end of the fiscal year. So if people take advantage of that, it may mean that collections on last year's income collected this year may be down, which could depress the local income tax distributions in 2021. Almost certainly they'll be depressed in 2022, could be depressed in 2021. There's one more consideration. You may remember that the last 2 recessions, what happened was distributions ran ahead of collections because distributions are set in advance. They were set too high, and then when the recession hit, collections were lower, and the balances in many counties' accounts were run into the red, were run into negative. And therefore, for several years after, the distributions had to be limited until collections caught up and eliminated those negative balances. Now, after the last time this happened back in the Great Recession, we changed the way these things are done. And the first thing we did was say, hey, we're going to base distributions on money that is actually collected. So, you know, the money should be there. But just in case, we said, and we will set the balances in the account at 15% of the usual distribution. And I happen to know that this number, this 15% number, was based on what happened to Elkhart County in the Great Recession. Elkhart County chosen because it's the most volatile county in Indiana. Unemployment rate went up to 20 in Elkhart County during the Great Recession. And the Great Recession period chosen because, well, how could anything get worse than that? The worst recession since the Great Depression. Surely we're never going to see anything as bad as that. Oh, wait. Well, we're going to test that bit of research, and I know that was how it was decided because I did that research. And so that particular prediction that 15% would be enough is going to be severely tested, and I'm looking at that with trepidation. If collections fall so much that distributions cannot be met, that would mean limited distributions into future years until balances are restored. So that's another thing to take account of as far as local income taxes are concerned. So as far as the two big tax sources for local governments, we could see near-term impacts because of payment delays. We could see impacts over the next year or two because of the lags, and we could see longer-term impacts as well for the property tax because of the maximum levy growth quotient, and for the local income taxes if that 15% in balances doesn't turn out to be adequate. State road aid, well, people aren't driving. Ordinarily, a fall in gasoline prices, and they're under $2, at least here in West Lafayette, and likely to head down. I mean, I guess I can look again at the Wall Street Journal and see what the price of crude is right now. Crude oil is down to 20 bucks a barrel, and the last time it got down that low, the price of gasoline went down into the $1.60, $1.50 range. So I'm expecting prices to fall not only because of the excess supply of crude, but also because of the lack of demand for gasoline. But ordinarily, you'd expect that to increase gasoline sales. Not this time. And when people are sequestered, as we are, they're not going to be driving. And motor fuel tax collections, the excise taxes, are based on gallons sold, and gallons sold will be down. So one can expect, since that's sort of pay-as-you-go, whatever's collected is distributed through the MVH and LRNS formulas. That's going to be down. Gasoline user tax, which is the sales tax on gasoline, will suffer, that revenue will suffer not only from the decline in gallons sold, but also from the decline in price. And so that will be down as well. So one would expect that state road aid is going to take a pretty big hit, and that's going to happen pretty soon. State school aid, what about that? Well, that depends on how long and how deep the recession is, and how severe is the state revenue loss, and how much federal aid comes our way. Speaking of a report, the state revenue report for March should be released next week, unless they run into some troubles. They always release it at the end of the first week or the second week of the month. And so we will see. Now, that will be partial, of course. The second half of March is when the problems hit, but we should see an impact, and this will be a very interesting read on what's going on out there. And they always publish not only the numbers, but a commentary on the numbers. I will be reading that commentary as soon as it comes out. What about other? You know, they've actually got yellow police tape around the city park in my neighborhood to keep the kids out. So parks are shut down. That's a free park, so there aren't fees for that. But one guesses if Indigo is not charging fees, if courts are not operating, fines may not be collected. So there's going to be losses of charges and fees from suspended activities. And I'm sure those of you in local government know more about the other miscellaneous revenues that might be affected. All right, policies that have been adopted, just briefly, monetary fiscal policy. What do we got? Oh my gosh, the Fed has been aggressive. Over the course of just 2 weeks, they cut their interest rate, the federal funds rate, all the way to 0. First thing they announced is $1.5 trillion in loans to the financial markets to keep them operating. And remember, it's really important to remember that those are loans. That's not bailouts, that's loans. Right? All of that money is going to be paid back if the Fed's policy is effective, if they can keep financial firms in business, if they can keep them from loans from going into default and that sort of thing, if they can keep markets from freezing up, then all that money is going to be paid back. And, you know, the last time they did this, back during the Great Recession, almost all that money was paid back. So these are not bailouts. Don't get fooled by that. The Fed is doing what it's doing. It's being the lender of last resort, and that's their job. And we got to hope that their policy works, because if financial markets shut down, we've got even bigger problems. So the Fed has been extremely aggressive, reacted far faster than they did even in the very aggressive actions they took against the Great Recession. So kudos to the Fed. The CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, that's that $2 trillion in additional spending. This is money for households. This is money for businesses. This is monies for states and cities. This is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So lots of different ways of putting dollars, income, replacements for sales, replacements for wages out there into the economy. $2 trillion is 9% of our GDP, and that means we'll be sending, if all of this money is counted as spending in the budget, that would send our budget deficit up into the 13–14% range, which would be higher than at any time during the Great Recession, but would only be half of what we had it during World War II. And if you are thinking of this as a kind of wartime act here, a wartime response, we ran deficits up way bigger than this during World War II and came out of that with a very strong economy. So I wouldn't worry too much about these temporary deficits, especially with an interest rate at less than 1%. It's costing us practically nothing to borrow this money. Disaster relief, you know, here's how I see it. You know, what are we doing here? We're hoping for a quick recovery from this downturn, and I regard this as disaster relief. It's more like this giant hurricane has taken on the entire world, and we've got to keep us going. We've got to provide disaster relief. This is a bridge from February out to the time when we finally get the virus under control. And what we hope is that everybody comes out of it whole. Right? If consumers can get out and spend again, if businesses reopen and employ all the folks, if financial markets are working fine, then we can resume the economy that we had in February. But if consumers use up their savings, if they go bankrupt, if they lose their jobs and those jobs don't come back, if businesses fail, if financial markets freeze, then the effects of this thing will linger and linger and linger, and we can have a very long downturn. What we need is money to keep us going, to provide that bridge, to keep us afloat until the virus is under control, and then we can get back to business as usual. That's the hope, anyway. I think that's the goal of the fiscal policy. Finally, what can we learn from history?
Hey, Larry?
Yes.
Larry, I'm going to pause you for a second. We're supposed to end at 1.
Oh.
But you're fine. I just wanted to let people know I'm going to let Larry keep going, and we'll take some questions. This is being recorded, so if you need to drop off and take care of other things or go to another meeting, I'll post that to our website. That way you can go back and watch whatever you missed. So Larry, go ahead and take your time.
I am within about 5 minutes of finishing here, so sorry about that. I do get excited, as those of you who have heard me know. What can we learn from history? Hey, there was a recent article. How recent? March 26th, 2020. That came out by some of the economists in the New York Federal Reserve, and the title says it all. Pandemics depress the economy, public health interventions do not. Evidence from the 1918 flu. So they took what data was available from that pandemic, that flu pandemic that hit the world right after World War I, and cost so many hundreds of thousands of lives in the United States, and said, what was the impact on the economy? And the point they're trying to make by this title is saying, look, if you hadn't done anything, the pandemic by itself would have depressed the economy. It's the pandemic that is causing the recession, not the public health intervention, not the shutdown of our economy. The shutdown of our economy is our response to this to try to shorten the inevitable recession that would have occurred. You know, think about what happens, right? If we do nothing, and if you have millions of people die, nobody's going to go shopping. No one's going to take trips. No one's going to want to go to work. Supply chains are going to be disrupted. Financial markets are going to freeze up. A pandemic like that is going to crash your economy. What are we doing? We're saying, okay, let's shut it down to try to get this virus under control, and then we can restart it. Yes, this is going to be a historically big downturn, but maybe we can shorten the impact, lessen the impact by taking these measures. And that's what they found when they looked at what happened in 1918. And just read a couple of sentences from what they concluded. Using geographic variation in mortality during the 1918 flu, that is, they looked at many different cities that had many different responses to the epidemic, the pandemic. We find that more exposed areas experience a sharp and persistent decline in economic activities. Places where people live densely populated, you get bigger impacts from a pandemic, of course. The estimates imply that the pandemic reduced manufacturing output by 18%. We didn't have GDP back then, but they did have indexes of manufacturing output, 18% decline. Okay, that's a big drop. We find that cities that intervened earlier and more aggressively did not perform worse. That is, shutting things down did not hurt your economy any more than if you didn't shut the thing down and just let the pandemic run. And if anything, those that shut down earlier and more completely grew faster once it was over. Pandemic ended quicker for those folks, and the recovery began and was a faster recovery. Our findings thus indicate that non-pharmaceutical interventions, and by that they mean, hey, there's no antidote to the virus, there's no vaccine. Non-pharmaceutical interventions mean a shutdown of the economy. Not only lower mortality, keep the death toll smaller, they also mitigate the adverse economic consequences of the pandemic. Pandemic effect on the economy is less if you take a more aggressive response. And I think that's certainly a lesson that we want to keep in mind as we do this thing to ourselves. Last comment here. What do we got? V-shaped or L-shaped? Are we going to have a quick, sharp recovery or lingering misery? And that's the $60,000, $22 trillion question. What's going to happen? V-shaped recession, that's what we hope for. We've got this very quick, very sharp downturn, quickest, sharpest downturn ever. Can we have a nice, quick, sharp recovery? Well, what depends on that? What would that depend on? It depends on exploiting pent-up demand. If we spend weeks or a couple of months not consuming, and we are suddenly released, we're going to go out and buy. Could be a huge party in July, right? That's what we would like to see. And we want people to be able to spend. That is, we want their savings to still be intact. We want their jobs to still be intact. And we want those folks who supply the products that we want to buy and the services we want to buy, we want them to be still in existence, and we want to be able to get loans in order to do this stuff from the financial markets, and we want our deposits, of course, to still, well, deposits will still be there. But we want financial markets to be working. If we can bridge ourselves, and if we can keep this thing short enough, we can have a V-shaped recovery. But if Fed somehow fails in its mission, if the $2 trillion isn't enough, or if it's poorly targeted, if lots of people deplete their savings or go bankrupt, if lots of firms close because of their loss of sales and they can't pay their interest and can't pay their suppliers and can't pay their employees, if those jobs disappear, if financial markets freeze up as a result of this downturn, then we can't have a quick, sharp recovery. We get instead an L-shaped recession, a big, sharp decline, and then lingering misery. It also depends then, so it depends on our response policy-wise. It also depends on how long this takes. It depends a lot on how cooperative people are with the shutdown. So, you know, our recovery depends on everybody washing their hands, depends on everybody staying home, everybody keeping their distance, everybody basically doing what they're asked to do. And if everyone does that, we've got a greater likelihood of a V-shaped recovery rather than the L-shaped recession, which we certainly do not want. Well, that's what I have to say. What little is known, what we speculate about, using information on how things work and what policies have been adopted. If you've got questions, I'd certainly be interested to hear them. And if I have an answer, I'd be willing to give it. Thanks very much.
Okay, Larry, I've got the first question for you.
All right.
Do you think there will be a delay in receiving any of our spring property tax settlement? And if our spring property tax settlement is affected, would they send a supplemental settlement once those late payments are received?
Oh, that's a good question. As I understand the rules, the May 10th date is fixed. And so if the June distribution depends on that May 10th date, then you'd get a shortfall below the levy. You know, I guess I haven't got a real good answer on that. The question basically laid out the possibilities. If the governor can say, hey, we're delaying penalties, can there be a statewide declaration that, hey, we had the late payments, we can have a late second distribution after the June settlement distribution? You know, maybe, you know, and I suppose it might depend a little bit on just how big the shortfall is. If this creates emergencies all over the place, but payments are actually coming in, maybe the treasurers will be allowed to distribute the money. Right? The treasurers collect it and the auditors distribute the money. So that's a possibility. I don't have an answer, and you know, when you ask what do I think it would certainly make sense to do that. Whether that's allowable within the rules is another.
So we just had a comment that Marion County is giving in advance in July or August.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go. And you know, this is one way I always say. One way I play expert is to take what I learned from one meeting and use it in the next. So now I can say, what is that in some counties there will be an additional distribution from payments. So that's good to hear.
Well, and Allen County added auditor offices can send advances to tax units prior or post-June settlement. So they do have that flexibility.
Good.
I mean, property taxes exist. So people, you know, if delinquency rates went up, that would be the issue. If it's just late payments, then it sounds like you can work around it.
If it's actual delinquency, then you're basically out of luck. The money's not collected. But if it's just late, that's so good. That's good.
I think that maybe our only question, I'm seeing some things about, you know, is helpful or good info. We'll hang tight for another minute or two to see if there's any other questions that come through or interesting things that you have to share that we don't know. Because I think that's really where we're at right now. Lower rate with the unemployment rate because of the additional $600 included in the CARE Act. Some may make more on unemployment. That's,
you know, that's the moral hazard question that always comes up with unemployment insurance. If you make your unemployment insurance program generous, so generous that you can actually earn more on unemployment than you can actually working, will people not go back to work? At the moment, of course, we want people not to go back to work, right? So we're essentially saying, hey, folks, we realize that you can't go back to work, or we would really hope that you don't go back to work, and as an incentive for that, we're going to be very generous with unemployment insurance. Now, once the virus is defeated, perhaps removing that extra $600 might be the appropriate thing to do. But, you know, I generally think that the moral hazard thing is overstated. There are so many benefits to going to work relative to sitting at home and collecting unemployment insurance that I would guess that once we are released from captivity, almost everybody will want to go back to work, if only for the social contact rather than stay home. But you know, it's a consideration. It's not an immediate consideration, but it's one for months from now when the virus is defeated and the shutdown is lifted.
So I would also just say we have several counties saying that their auditors will be doing the same. If you're not a county unit, so townships, cities, and towns, schools, so forth, if you want to reach out to your county auditor and ask that question, I think that would make sense. Or county auditors, if you want to send a quick email to those other units, I think maybe that communication would be helpful.
And hey, copy us on the email. We'd like to hear.
So Steve Geisen asked, the food and beverage tax will obviously be affected. Have you had a chance to look at that data, or do you have an estimate of for projecting food and beverage taxes for 2020?
Well, I'd say basically you take your food and beverage tax from last year or the most recent year that you've got, you zero it out. I think that'd be the most prudent thing to do. Yes, some restaurants are running on carry-out and delivery, but zero it out and multiply that by whatever fraction of the year you think this thing will last. I think that'd be the most sensible thing to do. Maybe you get a little bit more than what that would produce, but I think that's the thing to do. Had the experience there. My sister said, "Hey, let's get some food delivered to mom in the retirement community because the food there sounds like it's getting pretty bland." And so we said, well, we'll go to her favorite restaurant. Favorite restaurant wasn't doing carry-out. We'll go to her second favorite restaurant. Well, they were doing limited carry-out, but not the meal that she especially liked. We went to her third favorite restaurant, and yes, they were in full operation. So it's pretty spotty out there. Tamara, I don't know if you've noticed, you probably haven't noticed, Mad Mushroom, one of our favorite restaurants.
One of your favorites.
Yeah, it's not only doing carry-out and delivery, but they've got a very elaborate coronavirus-safe delivery system. And I ordered pizza. We put a table out on the porch, covered it with a tablecloth, and paid online with a generous tip, as advised. The guy drove up, and he put the pizzas on the table and left, and we waved at him through the window. So some of these restaurants were either prepared or thought it up real quick, or maybe some of the restaurant associations are giving out advice. I don't know. But I think in general on food and beverage, you better just zero it out for each month that this thing lasts.
Yeah, for a prudent estimate.
Yeah.
We also had a question whether you're being consulted by the governor or who are his economic consultants. I can say that's not us, not you.
Yes. And there's no reason why the governor should be necessarily consulting me. I think everything I said about state finances is well known to Chris Johnston, and in fact, he knows better than I do. You know, coming up with a number for income is an attempt at getting at the numbers that are arriving every day at the Department of Revenue and that the budget agency is keeping track of. So I think they've probably got a better handle than anybody on what's going on with state revenues, you know, they will let us know next week. I hope we will get the usual report on what's going on.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'll just thank everybody for joining us today. And like I said, this is recorded. It will be on our website, cdext.purdue.edu/OLG COVID-19. I also entered that in the chat box, and I'm sure you've received several emails from me. So, so we'll post the recording there, and don't forget to join us tomorrow. We have a webinar with Dr. Song at 12 p.m. on crisis communication. I'm really excited about this webinar. It's my first time working with Dr. Song, but he is from Korea, so he has not only, he's a professor at Purdue in communication, but he has that experience of seeing how communication was handled in South Korea, and also comparing that to what we're doing here, and kind of talking about some of those practical things that maybe we can implement as local government. So feel free to sign up for that one and join us for that. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Tamara. Thanks, everybody. Stay healthy.